Welcome to the latest Red Pill Fiction Factory interview. This one is with writer Karl Dahl from somewhere in North America. He's the author of the thriller Faction. I found Karl's biography on the web. I discovered him on Twitter, I think, to start with, but then I found his biography on the web, and it's one of the best I've read in a long time, so I'm going to quote it verbatim. Karl Dahl is a real hard-working American who likes big words and big ideas. His indoctrination certificates in, and then the next few words are redacted, were earned at a prestigious institution in the smouldering ruins of what was once an idyllic provincial backwater. Mr. Dahl lives in, and then the next words are redacted with redacted, and enjoys physical culture in the outdoors, things that go pew, 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 and reading pre-Enlightenment literature and history. Hi, Karl. Yeah, excellent. And also your comments on Twitter are well worth following. You're very outspoken and in a good way. Are we allowed to know anything else about you, or is everything else redacted as well?
It's a bit cheeky, but yes, I tend to keep it along those lines. The one thing that I will say, and is probably extremely obvious from Faction, is that I am a Gen Xer. You can fill in the blanks on a lot of other areas, but I would assume that it's extremely obvious.
I should have mentioned the book is called Faction. Can you explain the title? I was thinking it was one thing when I started reading it, but as it evolved, there's another meaning to it, it seems to me. Can you clarify what Faction, why you've entitled it Faction?
Sure. So the long and the short of it is that when you look at the way the United States government, for example, specifically works, and I write this from the perspective of someone who avoids such nonsense, but I have a great many friends and have had a great many friends and family, mentors, etc., who are intimately involved in government work and of various types. And what typically happens is that you have various factions vying for influence in the different situations that we're in. So when you look at US foreign policy and you say it seems rather schizophrenic, that is correct. You have power, and then you have these various folks who are involved at different levels with varying relationships to the people locally or not, and varying contexts and priorities. So you rarely get a transparent, good faith explanation of a situation. You get a explanation, cynical or otherwise, from a member of a faction that is participating in X event. So the story of Faction is from the point of view of an individual that is within one of these factions of deep state shenanigans.
Okay, it's funny because when I saw it first mentioned on Twitter, I think I was thinking the story is going to be sort of fiction and fact merged, and in a way it is, although it goes off in a different direction. We live in a world right now completely where the lines between fact and fiction seem to be completely blurred.
Yes.
And I think that was clever in that sense, the way it works. Can you tell us about the book? I would the plot, the main characters, and the main themes, and where it's set, and so on. Please give the audience a kind of an idea of what it's about.
Absolutely. So, one of my favorite descriptions is one that a reader made recently, and they described it as a grunge era version of another novel that was not really related to the novel tremendously, other than a high level of realism and a very individual or small group angle on the kind of operations that take place in it. And it is very grunge era, and that again, that was very deliberate. It takes place in the mid '90s, the vast majority of it, and the setting is in and around Seattle, Washington State, USA. There is an operation in Toronto, Canada, and I chose Toronto for reasons that I think will stick out for readers. It's a very odd city. It's a very post-national place. There are very charming aspects to it, but one can become unmoored there very easily. And then the rest of the story goes into Hispaniola, as it were. Goes off into a different non-Anglosphere world after things fall apart. The main protagonist is Douglas Shea, who is a university student. He is the scion of a family that is involved in various government sneaky business. One of the angles that I took here is that very well documented. For example, the Central Intelligence Agency does a tremendous amount of its work through shell companies, private individuals on paper, private organizations on paper, where they funnel money and equipment. In the modern era, you get contracts for support work, and that's been going on for quite a long time. And I know people who have worked for these.
Yeah.
And
Sorry, I'll interrupt. I've just been reading a bit on that, and a lot of it's because it gives the government a clean record if they're investigated by
yes,
other authorities. They can say, no, we haven't touched that kind of thing.
Correct.
Little is it known that they've just financed the whole Deloitte or somebody to do the whole thing for them.
Absolutely.
Sorry, go on. Don't let me interrupt. I interrupt.
Oh, no worries. His grandfather is another major character, Joseph Shea, and he is. These are very American types. Joseph is spelled with a clearly Slavic influence, and he is Serbian and Scottish. And the idea here is that part of this is my love of the American mutt, being one, and the strangeness that you get where names become unmoored from their original cultures, and in America we mispronounce them or we pronounce them some funny way. And so that was something that I just kind of played with there, and it plays out in the story a little bit. I'm working on the prequel, which we can talk about later, but that becomes much more in the forefront. And the long and the short of it is that the story starts out with spoiler alert, it happens within 5 pages. Doug's father is killed in the early 80s by some not nice government people. And the long and the short is jump to the mid 90s. Doug is a university student, and he's pulled into this family business, partly through the fact that Joseph obtained these suppressed government records regarding the killing of his son, Doug's father, and has to do a job to in payment, essentially, which he's incapable of doing because of his age. Doug gets pulled in, and it's really obvious, that was the point all along. It wasn't something, his ascendancy into this world has been planned. He's been trained for it and prepared for it. And at this point, what happens is you have the mix of his personal life, which is in many ways very normal for the era and very messy for the era. And a lot of this is me talking about that, because I think a lot of times, especially More conservative older people are, they have clear lines on morality and behavior, which I think is fair and legitimate. But at the same time, a lot of times they don't really understand how messy that is in, like, for example, a youth culture perspective. The dominance of these messages and themes and behaviors in a youth culture setting. So I wanted to talk about it a little bit. I will say and editorialize a little bit for writers out there that this has been a big, I've gotten a pretty strong response from that. A lot of people will throw up a hard line on some of these areas, especially drug related, which again, in my heart, I'm like, oh, you understand the message that I'm saying, or you're morally correct. But I kind of want to play it out. There's an angle in American, how should I say, current events / dare I say, pending, looming conflict type literature and posting online and the stuff, where there's a big libertarian, hooray for drugs, hooray for etc., alcohol, whatever, that one of the things that I do here is show how utterly foolish that is in a world where you are engaging in these types of things. Sobriety is your friend. Yep. When you're battling extremely competent people. There aren't breaks. You can't hit the pause button and go out on a date.
Yeah.
So,
all very true. I have to say the two characters, Joseph and Doug, are very endearing, and I congratulate you on that. They keep it together. I think it was very important Joseph was Slavic. Somehow, it unfortunately, we think of the average, I don't know, how should we call it, suburban white, older generation, the boomer, as kind of passive and indolent and a bit decadent. But somehow, if he's Slavic, you can imagine him being quite retaining a lot of those old-fashioned
yes,
anachronistic characteristics like ruthlessness and harsh training and the other aspects that he brings to the novel.
In fairness, I will say that the boomers in my life are more like that than the other kind. The dedication page, Jim is one of my mentors. His spirit is throughout the book, and he is very much of the old school. He did this stuff for a living. It was really? It was a little more formal than that. For a long time, his spirit is throughout the book, and his son, who is a dear friend of mine who has since passed, there is a possible version of him in this story, and this was kind of my song to them.
Okay. I thought it was good as well. You picked the FBI, or interesting and good, but that you picked the FBI as the baddies. Well, let me extrapolate a bit. We've been brought up originally to think they were the good guys always. Yes. We've learned since that they're the bad guys. Now, somewhere in the middle, they were frequently the bad guys, but in a kind of counter-intuitive sense. The good, honest FBI guy turned out to be the real evil player. So it was portraying even the good one. It was casting doubt, if you like, on the integrity of even the good ones. But now what we're really seeing is they're just straight up bad guys, a lot of them, from top to bottom. But few people treat them that way. It's always generally avoided that issue, and you've tackled it head on, and that works now. I'm not, 20 years ago, people would have scratched their head and wondered what you were talking about. But I think they've revealed their colors in the last decade. Go on.
Yeah, and one thing I would say is, so I was in high school, to date myself, during Ruby Ridge, and when they murdered the Branch Davidians in Waco, Texas. People can argue about right and wrong there, but the gloating as the FBI agents stood in the ruins of, I want to say, I think 93 people died there, including many children. And it was completely deliberate. We've seen the infrared footage of it, etc. That was a stake in my heart in a lot of ways when I was a young person, and brought up to be moral and loving America and patriotic, I dare say, which people will scoff at, but I still feel that way for at least my ancestors and the country that I grew up in, the people of them. But yeah, that was deliberate. And the other aspect of this, though, is that I use this as an opportunity to talk about morality in the novel. And that's one of these things where when you read a lot of stories of this kind that are newer, you will occasionally see it, but morality is a huge issue in everything that we do. And you have people slugging it out, and they have their own survival as a concern, but then they also have to think about the fact that an awful lot of these people who could be affected by these things, that are, let's say, in helicopters with a really bad guy trying to kill you, are literally honorable people who are patriots, who are just going after who they think is the bad guy. And it's something that people have to think about. It's something that you have to resolve yourself to. And for any FBI agents who might be listening, I heart America. This is an account of peace. And if my wife is holding a baby, please don't shoot her. I know that's a habit that you guys tend to have.
We're not painting every single one of them, but
Of course.
some of the things that are emerging of their behaviour recently are quite staggering, and it does seem systematic and deep-rooted rather than just random.
There's always a place for evil people to go to climb the ranks, and the guys at the bottom are generally not that, but they work for some awful people.
Yeah. You obviously know your matter. I won't go. You don't have to divulge how and why. Guns. You say in your bio that you like things that go pew pew pew.
Yes.
It's very evident in the book. What's all that about? You're just a happy gunner, are you? Gunsman, or whatever the word is, outdoorsman, should we call it?
Yes, I have been using them since I was a young lad, and one of the most critical things that I would say is that a lot of the stuff that I learned was good stuff, but an awful lot is on the sloppy side. One of the things that males especially, or let me rephrase, professional trainers will say that males come into it thinking they know what they're doing, and that women are actually easier to train with firearms and an awful lot of things like that, because they are dispassionate and they don't think they know anything. They're ready to learn. And the average person out there would do very well to have some professional training of one kind or another if you're handling firearms. If not because you don't have competence, but because you will learn a lot. You will be humbled, and you will learn how much you suck at it, even if you feel like you're pretty competent. So I will say that. What I will say to your point is that I have a tendency to get very passionate about firearms and weird firearms and interesting firearms. And I'm actually teasing myself a little bit in the story because there's a fixation on a specific caliber for a while. I get it out of my system, and then I explain why it's a bad idea to have a fixation on a specific weapon or caliber from a forensic perspective. For example, if you want an example of that, that is a true story. The name doesn't come to mind, but in Washington State, there was a federal prosecutor that was killed by someone and Tom Wales, Wales, and the government spent something like 15 years and staggering amount of resources to pursue the person who did it. And the person who did it, we still don't know who they are. They used a specific barrel for a specific weapon that was manufactured by one company, and the markings on the barrel made that evident. And basically everyone who ever purchased one of these barrels has had the FBI in their face. And a lot of people's lives were ruined because I don't know, they had paperwork issues or whatever, but they still don't know who did it. And I'm kind of talking about that a little bit. At least one of my early readers will laugh and say, "No, you're just a nerd," and had to gently encourage me to dial it in quite a bit.
Okay. The novel is full of subtle asides and casual mentions of your political and sociological leanings. I'm going to read a few short excerpts to give people
Sure.
an idea, and maybe after that you'll tell us how you came to be red-pilled as such, and what brought you there, and where you think things are going. One boyfriend is you mentioned his balding effect leather, and he has a leather-elbowed sweater-wearing. Oh, this woman has a balding effect leather-elbowed sweater-wearing boyfriend, which I thought was great. It's just perfect image in 4 words. Poor Doug sits through endless lectures about Margaret Mead, and then there's one about Joyce Carol Oates, who is described as a creaky cat lady who couldn't write anything relevant if someone put a gun to her head. So this will give the reader or the audience an idea of where you're coming from. There were some more poignant ones. Victory and defeat you address. Doug is remembering a lecture he'd had. What was it the Cambodian royalist soldier told him in his foreign policy class about the worst thing he saw during the war? It was losing. It wasn't the bombings, the acres of blasted trees strewn with pulverized bodies, soil turned to mud from the blood of hundreds of teenage soldiers, or even the killing fields. Losing ushered in the latter. Okay, he reminded himself, so don't lose. Again, great passage. And then on architecture, he's in Toronto. And he looks at the largest newspaper's atrocious-looking basement in the air, in inverted commas, a low, boxy turd deposited just north of the rail yard in the 1950s, which peeks at them as they round Wellington. To the east looms the iconic CN Tower, which Doug can't help but compare to the Space Needle, where he's from in Seattle. A tall, pointless, but visually interesting relic of mid-century retro-futuristic design. To Doug, the Space Needle looks like a UFO atop a skinny, elongated, white-framed Eiffel Tower. The CN Tower looks more like a baseball shoved partway down a syringe. You make clear your alliances and allegiances politically. So what drew you to that side of the spectrum, and what was it that you writing the book? The two are connected, I presume.
So I think some of it is just observation, right? And I think as time has gone by, in a lot of ways, I feel like I've become non-ideological as much as I will look at individual cases and issues and what's the goal and what's your priority. Because I think a lot of times talking about ideology can result in I'm on this team, I'm on that team. And people will often, the average person doesn't arrive at their quote unquote political beliefs through careful consideration and debate. It's about where their allegiances lie, right? And really what it comes down to is like Carl Schmitt would describe the friend-enemy distinction, right? Like that's the most fundamental in politics. And if you're not taking that into account, you have trouble wrapping your head around these things. And so
Can
a
you
lot of,
explain the Carl
yeah.
Schmitt's? I don't know that.
So some of his, let's say he was a 20th century German guy, with some aspects of that being very negatively received, but he actually fell out with the guy with the funny mustache very early on. But he's this incredibly influential legal theorist and political commentator, and he was extremely critical of just blanket like liberalism, which an awful lot of political ideology, like supposedly American quote unquote conservatism, it's a form of liberalism
Yeah.
with economic ideas that, again, depending on what time, what year it is, right, Richard, depending on what year it is, we all believe different things. And so this is mostly just me shit posting, right? Like, um, that when you meet a guy who looks like a stereotypical effete professor type, or a grad student who's affecting a certain look because he has suede patches on his elbows. Like, I've known some guys who are really cool who are like that, but an awful lot of them are just awful to be around. And they're not very they live in their heads and they don't actually accomplish things, right? Like, one of the ways I would summarize it is that ideas are great, but a lot of them are garbage. I've phrased this differently in the past, but we're on YouTube. And character and action are what matters. So what you do really matters. Your ideas are important if they inform action that matters, that's beneficial, or at least not detrimental, especially. But a lot of times, stuff is silly. So I talked a little bit about architecture. Obviously, aesthetics are important to me. There's an awful lot about architecture in the book, and I actually had one reader complain about that, which was funny. And I'm just like, your opinion is hilarious, because if you walk around and you think architecture doesn't matter, like, doesn't it make you feel things? Architecture makes you
Every
feel things. It's not just there's an awful lot of awful institutional, I mean, you're
Yeah.
British, right? Like, how
Yeah.
awful a lot of like mid-century
Oh God, yeah.
architecture is. It's
It ought to
horrifying.
it ought to be obligatory to complain about architecture in every book ever written nowadays, because it's there in your face all the time, and people
Yes.
treat it as though it was just scenery. It isn't. It's an offense in front of you wherever you turn. And
And it makes you feel it, and it
yeah,
makes you feel things. And anyone who says that it doesn't either is not fully human, or they're lying. And I think most people are lying, or they don't know how to express it, right? Or they think they have to have some qualified opinion or some education that qualifies their opinion. And I say, no, you don't. You can say that
yeah.
building is horrifying and that
We
building
know
is
they
beautiful.
appreciate good architecture because people pay good money to go and visit castles or whatever it is, or
Yes.
just spend some time in a nice restaurant. But you're right. If you ask them to articulate what it's about, they haven't got a clue. But all the more important to raise the issue, as far as I'm concerned. Well done for doing so.
Thank you.
Um, so, your red pilling, how did it start? I agree entirely, by the way, with the thesis, and I call the channel the red pill channel. It's not right or left anymore. It's whether you can see outside the matrix or if
Yes.
you're trapped within it. And there are strange allies forming from all sides
Yes.
together,
Yes.
and strange enemies forming as well. People you
Yes.
think you can rely on, as Trump is finding out every minute of his daily life. What brought you to being red pilled in the first place, then?
Well, so I've talked about this a little bit. The folks in my life, I grew up with a lot of refugees from communist countries, Vietnam vets. I am a total Cold War baby. When I was young, I immersed myself in that. I don't know if it's advised or something that I would recommend. Fortunately, my son is not terribly interested in it. But when I was in middle school, I was reading memoirs from soldiers in Vietnam and stuff like that. And there's a lot of great adventure and it's extremely educational, but there's also a lot of horrifying stuff in that. And so I also, without being super specific, have a solidly religious background, conservative family, but reasonable people and like caring, compassionate people. Not compassionate conservatives. That's different. That's a meme. That's a lie with words. But you know, I also got to see the radical changes that happened in the area that I grew up in, and how radically different areas were. And I learned from that. I spent a number of years in international business. I've traveled a fair bit. I speak several languages, generally poorly. But I think that does a lot to your brain. I can read Romance languages fairly well. Right now, I'm reading a lot of Spanish language material. Thank God for Google Translate, but because my vocabulary is very limited, it's like a child's, but I'm functional in a couple languages. And what that means is I've dealt with lots of different kinds of people in lots of different situations and settings. And when you look at totally different worlds where you don't have a dog in the fight, your brain processes your own world completely differently. And I remember one time I came back to the United States after being gone for 3 weeks, and I was in a country that had been taken over by outsiders. A puppet government was installed. If you read about the situation on Wikipedia, for example, it's 90% lies, because it's described as a civil war. It was not a civil war. And when you see people's daily life and what actually happens there, you're like, my God, this is all lies. And then I came home and was like, what's the difference? So, it's that sort of stuff accumulates, and everyone will have different individual examples of things that really shocked them or moved them one way or the other. For me, having children was an awful lot of that. And I think what happens is, I think thinking people who are not stupefied with drugs and television and social media will generally have this experience. But yeah, everyone will have these things that are extremely impactful. This last election was ridiculously impactful. I know that this is going to be something we talk about for the rest of our lives. COVID-19 and all that's something that my children will talk about for the rest of their lives. It might even be not that big of a deal for them, given what's going on in the smoldering ruins of the American empire right now.
Yeah.
But the long and the short of it is that there's just all these things that have just staggered me. And so your brain has to adjust. And one of the things that I fall back on is that, because of my religious background, I have a very long time horizon, because of my educational background and just generally my interest in reading, that my mother frankly instilled in me. I just have long horizons and massive amounts of information to apply for context, so that I do that instead of worrying about how people describe it for me and say, here's the language and phrasing and concepts that I'm going to provide you that you're supposed to contextualize the world with. I have a lot more to work off of.
Yeah, it is a hell of a time to be alive.
Yes.
Absolutely incredible. And if you're a creative type, you can multiply that by 10 because your brain's just buzzing all the time. I would say, I think you need you need a good imagination to sort of interpret the data that's flooding you daily, because there's so much misinformation, disinformation. and so much that's inconceivable one day, but it's
Yes.
completely normal the next, that it takes a writer's brain almost to interpret it and to put it, pass it on to others in a more palatable form. Because Christ, even they will struggle, but the average person on the street is still decades, light years behind what's actually going on, I think.
And
Um,
my sainted grandmother would just look at it and say, "That's a load of bollocks."
that's right. I keep saying that. My grandparents would have said exactly the same.
Yes.
They could see through it much better than we can today, probably because they grew up with TV and they had a harder existence, which
Yes.
meant that you had to cut to the chase quickly. There was no room for all this fancy pants nonsense and indoctrination. They were just too ready for it. And anyway, yeah, that's for all. A bit of a detour. There's a great passage towards the end. I'm going to read an excerpt to show how you handle the violent scenes, because there's some good ones. It's a real thriller, this one. And Doug is off to go and with his grandfather. So you got a grandfather and grandson, quite an unusual coupling, off to kill a whole bunch of Albanian thugs. And one of them is called Big Shot. Big Shot is halfway into the back seat when the car blows in a short, sharp flash, lifting it 4 feet into the air before it crumples, its back broken. Big Shot is flung casually against the house. Doug moves as the car lands, both eyes open, aiming down the top of his weapon, and puts a short burst into Big Shot's head. Joseph shuffles up to the shattered driver's side window, firing his long suppressed handgun into the brain pans of the broken men in the car. He notes a small gym bag on the shotgun seat floor before turning his view to the house. The door of the house flies open and a fourth Albanian runs out into the cold air, wearing a tank top and brandishing a handgun. Doug stitches him with short bursts until he drops, a final burst anchoring him. Doug removes the empty magazine and puts it into his outer jacket pocket, then locks in a fresh one and press checks the bolt. He keeps the scorpion pointed at the doorway with one hand, while removing a tiny hand grenade from a pocket with the other. Holding the spoon down, he pulls the pin out with his strong hand pinky. Joseph walks up with his pistol pointed at the door. "Do it," he says. Very good. I'm envious. You do write as though you knew what you're talking about, but we won't go into that. Plans for another novel? You say, is it a prequel you said you're thinking of, or a sequel?
It's a prequel. I've thought about a sequel. I don't know how I would do it. I feel like and I've gotten this feedback from people, the epilogue, as it were, of Faction leaves room for more. But I don't know currently what I would do there. The prequel gets into an era that's talked about in the novel a fair bit, which is the Spanish Civil War. That's Joseph Shea's entree into the biz. And it is such a fascinating period, the interwar period.
Absolutely.
And the Spanish Civil War it really gets at the heart of what I will call the myth of the 20th century, which is a very good book, as well as a very good podcast series. But yes, it's fascinating. Now, here's the thing. There's very little quality English language material on it that is nuanced and dispassionate. It's very libtard oriented. There are exceptions. I've had to do staggering amounts of research for this because every time I sit down and start writing, I'm like, wait a minute, what kind of jacket would he have? And then it's kind of frustrating. I'm currently writing the in-depth training that Joseph receives in northern England, inspired largely by the SOE training during World War II. The head of those programs, Sykes Fairbairn, those guys, other worthies came from the Shanghai Municipal Police. So there's a fictional SMP officer who is training Joseph at a house with a couple of selected folks. The idea being that when you look at kind of the pre-World War II, when it really became industrialized espionage training, it was very loose and independent and interesting. And so I'm spending a lot of time on that sort of research, like where would you go in London to get a good jacket for this kind of a situation. So maybe it's me. I don't know how much of it I'm going to throw out. Maybe I'm a crazy person, but I want it to be as good as possible. And so I'm reading Spanish material. I am inventing a fake Japanese infantry manual from the Russo-Japanese War because the Asian military doctrine around trench warfare was light years beyond Europe's. By the close of World War One, the Germans, the Italians, and the British really had a really solid understanding of breaking through. But the Asians had a lot of that as well. So I have an SMP guy teaching some of that stuff from that context as well. Partly just because it's interesting and I'm a weirdo, but that's what I'm working on.
I think you've hit a great idea there. It's a fantastic, fascinating time. It was all the prototypes were being tested, really,
yes.
both technologically and ideologically.
Yes.
And it all came together in Spain. And it was a great advantage is you can have players from all over the world, English speaking. They don't have to be all Spanish by any means, because it wasn't like that. Who bring their own stories to it, like Joseph would. No, I think that's terrific. There's a couple of books coming out by, I keep seeing on Twitter, but they're being promoted. I'll look them up and I'll forward them, the details to you. Because I do think it's what we're facing now in the West is going to be much more like the Spanish Civil War than just about any other. I think Yugoslav also qualifies. Yugoslavia's Civil War, but it's about those two are leagues ahead when it comes to the similarities of what we're going through. An understanding of those is going to be critical. I think they're going to come back into fashion in a big way because of that.
Bolshevik Revolution as well. You might be alluding to it, but Mystery Grove.
Yes, that's it.
Is the go-to. Mystery Grove brought back Mine Were of Trouble, which is a fantastic narrative from a British volunteer with who I think is the most fascinating group in the Spanish Civil War, which is the Requetés, the Carlists, who are, it's very strange sounding to someone now, but they were royalists who basically chose a side with there was a succession argument, which is very classical, like in a historical perspective, but sounds bizarre in the 21st century. But the thing is, they weren't arguing about who the person was. They were arguing about really their mode of operation. But the flavor of those people is just so great. And it's really fun to play with. And it's really amusing to be like, no, the worst people in the world, according to our current ideology, when history started in 1945, actually supported the good guys, which you really should understand, especially if you're a Christian, let alone anything else. And the funny thing is, the good guys thwarted Funny Mustache Man at every turn when he tried to demand something from them, and they were just like, "No, but thanks for the air support." So it's funny because you'll read very online people who will go off about Franco and how he suppressed the Phalangists and the Phalange, and he really should have done what Funny Mustache Man wanted, and Franco was like, nope, this is a Spanish war, and this is Spain, and it belongs to Spain, and you don't own us.
And he handed it back to the Spanish people when the time was right. So you can hardly argue. And it'd be good as well because all the texts we get on it are from the other side of point of
Yes.
view,
Yes.
sympathizing with their loss, the Orwells of this world and stuff. So in that sense, I can see. Very interesting. Well, I think we'll call it a day there, Carl. I appreciate
Alrighty.
it. It's a terrific interview. I would like you to come back whenever you're ready with the next book. It sounds fascinating. I would like to hear from you.
I would love to. I'm targeting this year. I'm doing my best to get it done this year. God only knows if I'll be able to do it. So,
Well, no hurry, no pressure. Yeah, there's so much distracting on the television and the internet these days. With what's going on, it's almost impossible to concentrate. But we wish you luck with that, and
thank you so much.
hope to have you back. Thank you.